Okay, welcome to the KIN 425 discussion for today. As you see, I'm going to be discussing the journal article summary that was submitted by Yidong. The title of his summary is Effects of Carbohydrate Supplementation on Aerobic Exercise Performance During Acute High Altitude Exposure and After 22 Days of Acclimation and Energy Deficit. So quite a mouthful for the title. But essentially, what I'm going to try to summarize here is why you would want to take carbohydrate supplementation during aerobic exercise performance when you're exposed to altitude, and also why they did this energy deficit during the 22 days of acclimation. So I'm going to go to the whiteboard here to give you a brief outline of the study. So what they're looking at here is two groups. So I'm going to put just group 1, Group 2, they were randomized. One group took a carbohydrate supplement. The other group was given a placebo. And this was given during an exercise test that involved 80 minutes of walking. So they gave the carbohydrate supplementation during the 80 minutes of walking. And then immediately after the walking, they did a 2-mile run time trial. So it comes out to about 3.2 kilometers. And that's running time trial. So this is their aerobic performance measure for the study. They looked at these groups under 3 different conditions. One was at sea level. So that's their performance at sea level. One was acute exposure to altitude. And then the third condition was chronic exposure to altitude. So that was 22 days at the same altitude as the acute session. So what they're looking at here is whether carbohydrate supplementation helps your aerobic performance when you're exposed to acute altitude, and then also the effects of altitude acclimation. So keep in mind that the 3.2 kilometer time trial, if you think about typical aerobic performances, this is quite a short performance test. And so that's something to keep in mind with the limitations of this study. So one question here is why would you give carbohydrate supplementation at altitude during aerobic performance? The answer here is that at altitude, your muscles shift to preferring carbohydrate oxidation rather than fat oxidation. The reason why your muscles tend to switch to carbohydrate oxidation is, recall that with carbohydrates, you can get 5 calories of energy for every liter of oxygen that you consume, whereas with fats, you get 4.7 calories per liter of oxygen consumed. So these are numbers that we covered earlier in the course. The bottom line here is that at altitude, you're going to be compromised for the amount of oxygen you can get into your blood and into your muscles. And so it's good to use a substrate that will allow you the greatest amount of energy for a given amount of oxygen consumed. So at altitude, your muscles prefer to use carbohydrates than fats because you get a bigger bang for your buck. You get more calories of energy for a given amount of oxygen consumed. So what this study found, I should explain one more thing, why they did the, you can see they did the energy deficit during the chronic altitude exposure. The reason they did the energy deficit was that typically when you're exposed to altitude on a chronic basis, you tend to become nauseous at first. You get a little bit of loss of appetite. So people exposed to chronic altitude usually do go into an energy deficit and they lose weight, lose muscle mass. And so they just wanted to control for it during the study. So they put everyone on the same type of diet that induced the same caloric deficit. So quick results of this study. So this graph in the manuscript nicely displays the results. You can see up here they've coded the carbohydrate supplementation group as dark circles and the placebo group as squares. So each of these circles and each of these squares represents one participant in these groups. And these lines here represent the mean values. This is for performance tests during the 3.2 kilometer time trial after the 80-minute walk. So a lower score for the time trial represents a better performance. So you're performing the 2 kilometers the 3.2 kilometers faster. So this is at sea level. This is at acute hypoxic exposure. This is chronic hypoxic exposure. And for each condition here, they've compared the carbohydrate versus the placebo group. So carbohydrate versus placebo, carbohydrate versus placebo. What they found was that the carbohydrate supplementation had no effect on performance. So you can see the means are quite close at each condition. What they did find was that, as expected, your aerobic performance becomes worse at acute hypoxia. And then it became better with chronic hypoxic exposure with 22 days. So this performance is better than the acute performance, but the chronic hypoxic exposure was still worse than the sea level performance. So the bottom line here is in the study, carbohydrate supplementation did not make a difference for performance at altitude, but chronic altitude exposure helped these people to adapt to the altitude and improve your performance. So the important message here is that if you're an endurance athlete and you're going to compete at altitude, it's good to spend some time at altitude to get that chronic altitude adaptation so that your performance isn't deteriorated too much by the altitude. Now, the reason that they didn't find a benefit of the carbohydrate supplementation, I mentioned that a limitation of the study was the length of the performance test. So it's only 3.2 kilometers. So in this type of test, it's doubtful that you would be limited by glycogen depletion. So if they used a longer test that depleted more glycogen stores, perhaps the carbohydrate supplementation would have made a difference. So I think that's the main reason why they didn't find a difference between the carbohydrate and placebo group for this study. So that's pretty much it. That's the discussion for this